Good then. Thanks for the invitation. So my name is Paul Hager. I'm a PhD student at the Chair for AI in Healthcare and Medicine, affiliated with the Technical University of Munich and also the Klinikum Rechts der Isar. And the talk that I'm going to be giving today is called Large Language Models in Clinical Decision Making, based on a paper that we recently published in Nature Medicine. But before we get to medicine, let's talk about money. So why is AI so interesting? I mean, a lot of you probably already know. You're also part of here, you're attending a webinar series about AI. But there's been quite a lot of movement in the field recently due to technological advancements and technical advancements. Uh, Private investment has exploded. I mean, there's been $100 billion invested for the past 3 years at least. That's like the GDP of Croatia. People like the CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai, saying AI is one of the most important things that we're working on. It's more profound than electricity or fire. The hope here is, or the end goal here is, right, to create something that is mimicking human intelligence, that it can solve so many of the problems that we have. And previously, this is unlocking new kinds of use cases in many different fields, including medicine, which is really this end goal and this big hope that we have for the field as a whole. And if we look at where these 100 billion per year are going, about a quarter of it is going into generative AI. And so under that, it's anything that generates something, so either images or text, a large portion of that being, LLMs, or large language models. And this is based on the fact that, language is core to human intelligence. Mastering it is one of the central challenges. And advances in large language models bring us closer to this almost utopia of the artificial general intelligence that we will hopefully advance to at some point. This is a quote from Demis Hassabis, the CEO of DeepMind, which is the research arm of Google. And so the question is, why are these large language models so interesting? Because they're the first model that we've seen that really just gets better the bigger that we make it. So we've been able to scale them from millions of parameters to billions of parameters, and we keep seeing new capabilities kind of emerging, which has led us to this current theory that, okay, if we just take internet scale data and use very large models and just keep predicting the next word in the sentence, at some point we're going to get something that is kind of similar to AGI, and that's going to solve all of these amazing problems for us. That's kind of the dream, that's the hope, that's the hypothesis. And that's why a lot of us are currently working on understanding these kinds of models and trying to see what can they do, what can they not do, are we there yet, are we on the right path, right? Um, so this was a bit of a maybe an abstraction. If you still don't know what large language models are, it's basically ChatGPT. That's probably the most common way of referring to them today. It's also the most well-known implementation of a large language model. I just say this because I'm going to be talking about large language models throughout this talk. And so when I'm talking about a large language model, I'm talking about one of these models that is able to generate text freely, answer questions freely, and do all of these things that we know and hopefully love. Um, so why do we care about this in medicine, though, specifically? Well, because about 2 years ago, there was big headlines when ChatGPT in about January of 2023, for the first time passed the United States medical licensing exam without any help. Barely eking by with 60.2, but it passed. It was a huge step up. And then within the same month, MedPalm improved upon it by 7 points. So Google's AI health chatbot also cracks it. Then there are new things coming out. Okay, it's outscoring medical students. It's even better than doctors at some point. Then these really crazy headlines start coming out. Are you ready for AI to be a better doctor than you? Will AI substitute doctors in healthcare? Can artificial intelligence replace doctors? And part of the reason for that is on this benchmark that everybody in the medical language community has been using, this USMLE, which is basically a benchmark used in the United States. It's the United States medical licensing exam. So it's kind of like the Staatsexam here in Germany, where you answer questions to test your general medical knowledge on your way to being a doctor. It's a standardized test that you have to pass. And we use this for medical students, right? And so it's been a great way of kind of seeing, okay, how good are these models at understanding medical questions and answering them, right? And it's become very saturated recently. So up until about mid this year, we've hit low 90s. There's indications that there's a lot of label noise in there. So things that are data quality issues, ambiguous ground truth. And so basically, if you take a look at this and you say, oh, wow, these models are amazing, medicine is solved, nobody needs to become a doctor anymore, we can all go home now, right? We can just replace every doctor with an AI. Is maybe the wrong thing to take from this, of course, but it's kind of where a lot of the hype was going. Um, so we saw that and we decided to take maybe a bit of a closer look at what the USMLE actually measures. And so this is from a practice exam where they basically show that, okay, we have here a question, a case with some laboratory results, and then we have a multiple choice question and answer at the end, right? So what are we measuring here, right? Well, it's a multiple choice question, so there's only 5 valid answers. One of them has to be correct. I mean, it also makes sense, right? You're writing an exam for students. There can only be one correct answer. All the required information is already given up front. The students don't have the possibility of asking for more information, so you have to include everything that's in there. And you also have very classical symptoms, right? These aren't super crazy trick questions, very difficult cases. We're making sure that they understand the basics of medicine well enough to function as basic doctors, right? And this is great for maybe like a medical exam for early graduate students, but this is very removed from what a doctor does in his everyday life, right? So if we think about what happens in a hospital, a patient comes in and says, "Oh, my stomach hurts. I think I ate too much." And that's all the doctor has at the beginning to work with. And as you can see, this is already a very different scenario from what the United States medical licensing exam tests. So what does a doctor do in this case? Well, a doctor tries to gather facts, right? So they start with, okay, the history of present illness. Then they would do a physical examination, gather as much information from physically examining the patient as possible. And you see, this is already a multi-step process. And what they now need to do is they need to gather and synthesize data from diverse sources. So then they have at their disposal laboratory tests, they have imaging, and what they can do is then they iterate between this to exclude certain diagnoses, to gather evidence for diagnoses. And then at some point, they can give a diagnosis and a treatment plan. So this is a free form, so different also from multiple choice, but evidence-based diagnosis and treatment plan. And of course, doctors also work with real world data, right? So they work with real patients with all the nuances, complexities, and pains that accompanies that. And so this was kind of what we saw, and we decided, okay, well, is there a way that we can create a new benchmark that solves all of the problems that we had with the old benchmark and much closer mimics the actual clinical reality of doctors? Because this is when we'll really start to understand, can we use these language models in clinical practice? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? And are we on our way? Are we developing these models in a good direction so that we're really prioritizing clinical utility and not exam taking utility? So what we did then is there's this fantastic resource from the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center called the MIMIC database, which is just a dump of the electronic health records of hundreds of thousands of patients over about a 10-year time span, all of their discharge summaries, all of the radiologist reports, all of the laboratory values, microbiology, everything. And so we said, okay, let's try to build up a resource that hits exactly these 4 parts that we were just talking about. What we want is we need the history of present illness, we need the physical examination data, we need the laboratory result data, we need the radiologist report, and we need to know what the patient was diagnosed with. And so we started combing through this database and trying to find a way to how can we now create a new data set out of this to do precisely such a clinical decision-making task that is much more realistic and closely simulates and mimics such an emergency room environment. So when building a new data set, we decided to start at the bottom. So start with the disease. So the diseases that we're going to be looking at, we want them to have the same chief complaint, right? This is important because one, it's about differentiating diseases from another. Two, it's also important to have a model that is able to, let's say, work at least on one chief complaint. If you have a model that is only good for one specific disease, let's say heart attack, then anybody else that comes in with chest pain, what does the model tell you, right? It needs to at least kind of be applicable to a certain area of medicine. So having a similar chief complaint. It should be best case scenario, something that's clinically important in the emergency department, because we're going to spend all this money and time developing a model. It should be important diseases, right? We want also that for our data set that the range of modalities that are required for diagnosis. So under modalities, I understand, imaging and laboratory results and these kinds of things. They should be there that maybe some of the diseases in the data set are more better seen through imaging, some are better seen through laboratory results. This would allow us to truly understand how well these models use each of the modalities. And so for these reasons, we decided to focus on 4 abdominal diseases. So appendicitis, cholecystitis, diverticulitis, and pancreatitis, all with the same chief complaint of abdominal pain and all that are a type of inflammation of a different organ in the abdominal region. Just to give a bit of background, I'm actually a bioinformatician. I'm not a medical doctor. I work closely, and my first co-author, Friederike Jungmann, was the medical doctor that undertook all the medical decisions in this. So if I make any mistakes on the medical side, please forgive me. But I've managed to gain some knowledge over the past couple of months. So now that we've kind of selected our diseases and we're focusing on these 4 diseases, we then decided, okay, now we need to extract the information that's relevant, right? So for the discharge diagnosis, how do we know who actually is a good case of, let's say, appendicitis? So oftentimes there's multiple diseases in there, especially if we have like an entire table of ICD codes. There could be all of the secondary diagnoses, all of the previous diagnoses, the chronic conditions, right? So what we're interested in, what is a good quality case for us, that's a good case for this clinical decision-making task, is where the primary diagnosis is one of our 4 targets. Because this means that all the other information in the discharge diagnosis is going to be useful for diagnosing that patient. The lab results are going to support the diagnosis that we're looking for. The imaging results are going to support the diagnosis that we're looking for, and so forth. So if there are multiple diagnoses mentioned, the disease, one of our target diseases, must be the first diagnosis. So for example, if we see in our data set or in the MIMIC database, the primary diagnosis was cardiac arrest, secondary was pancreatitis, we do not include this because it's not the primary diagnosis and the reason why the patient came in, and all of the lab values and so on were chronic pancreatitis. So next, we extract the history of present illness. That's fairly straightforward. What's important here is, again, we do some data quality control. If people were transfers so that they already in the history of present illness, it stated what their diagnosis is. This means that the doctor attending this patient is not going to order the tests to diagnose this disease again, right? So again, this is a case that is unsuited for our task. In these cases, we leave out. Next, we move on to the physical examination. This is fairly straightforward. And then from the radiologist report, we have the full radiologist report with findings and impressions and conclusions and everything. What we do from that is we extract just the findings. We don't want the conclusions or the impressions, because oftentimes the radiologist will already diagnose the patient in there, and that is cheating. So we don't want to include that data, right? Finally, the last source of information that we have is the laboratory results. For this, we basically, because there are very many laboratory results, doctors oftentimes order repeat tests to monitor progression. We only always took the very first entry. This is a bit of a limitation. So for example, red blood cells and white blood cells was reported once at 9 and once at 13 o'clock. We only took the value the very first value in the database. This is because this is most likely the therapy naive value and most indicative of, the pathology. This is definitely a limitation and something that we're looking to address of maybe adding a temporal component of repeat asking for values, getting repeat or getting future values in the data set. But so what we do is for each unique laboratory result that exists for this patient, for their hospital stay, we record the first value and put that into our database. And so once we have all of this, this is basically our Mimic CDM data set. Mimic is the name of the database where we've taken the data from, and CDM for clinical decision making. So what we use as input is the history of present illness, the tools available for any model or that we've kind of gathered, or all the information that we've gathered about this case is in the physical examinations, the laboratory results, and the radiologist reports. And finally, we have the diagnosis and also what treatment the patient received, so what operations they have received, and basically what discharge treatments they have. So what this gives us is about 2,400 cases after some also manual quality control, about 1,000 appendicitis cases, 600 cholecystitis, 250 diverticulitis, and 500 pancreatitis. For everything, we have a physical examination. For every case, we have at least one laboratory test, often very many. You can see in total 140,000 laboratory tests, and 6,000 radiologist reports, at least one abdominal radiologist report also for each of our cases. So now that we've kind of built up the data set, we need to choose which models are we going to test, right? We're interested in testing large language models, the newest AI models. One problem is so that this database that we're using very explicitly prohibits using their data with online platforms like ChatGPT, OpenAI, or through their APIs. Because of data sharing agreements and everything like that. And we are also, big supporters here at our lab of using open source models because we believe it's quite important, especially in such a sensitive area like medicine, that the tools and the progress that we make is not beholden or not dependent on any one company. It would be a sad future if every hospital in the world is dependent on OpenAI. So what we did use then was local or the open weight models is what they're called. Is for example, Llama 2 Chat from Meta. And what this means is you can download it, you can do with it what you want, and once it's on your server or running locally, you can give it as much patient information as you want, and it never leaves your server. We use Llama 2 Chat and two derivatives of it called Open Assistant and Wizard LM. These are the best performing basically models. They're general purpose models that can basically do, they're not specified, they're not specifically tuned for medicine, but what they are is what's called instruction tuned, which means that they can handle new tasks. And this is quite important because our clinical decision making task is a completely new task. No language model has been trained on this yet. And so these are capable of basically taking our instructions, ask for tests, and I'll give you their results, and being able to run with it. On the other hand, there are also two variations of this that are medically fine-tuned, so that are quite good at, or should be better at medical tasks, but they are not instruction tuned. So they cannot do this kind of back and forth gathering of information. This led us then to say, okay, well, let's consider two scenarios then. So the first scenario is what we've been kind of talking about, the more realistic scenario of this fully automated emergency room diagnosis. We present the history of present illness to the model. We prompt the model to think about the case, which has been shown in the literature to improve performance. It then gives us an action like give me the physical examination, and then we return exactly only the physical examination information and prompt it again to think about the case and then give us a new action. And then if it gives us an action like laboratory results or imaging, it must also specify precisely what it wants. What laboratory results does it want? In this case, complete blood count and the amylase values. Or if it wants imaging, it needs to specifically say, I want ultrasound abdominal. I want chest x-ray. And we only give it exactly the data that it requests. There's no list of stuff for it to choose from. It needs to freely decide based on the facts that it has seen in the case, what it wants to order, and that is what we will give it. If the information does not exist for this patient, then we return that, okay, this modality or this data type is currently not available. Please give us something else. And then at the beginning, we tell the models that once they've gathered enough information and are confident, they can give us a final diagnosis and then give us their treatment plan, which they then do. Because we also wanted to do this takes quite a while, and we wanted to test some other aspects like robustness and also these other models that are not able to do this new type of task. We also have a second scenario, which we call mimic clinical decision making full information, or mimic CDM-FI, which I'll be using green color to refer to, where we basically we construct the full condensed discharge summary with all of the pertinent information for diagnosis. So the history of present illness and the physical examination, the lab results, and the radiologist report. And then we only ask it for a diagnosis. So just diagnosis, double point, colon, and then we let it run. And so any model can do this. They don't need to be specifically trained for this. And what this then does is allows us to more quickly iterate and test also some things on the sides. Um, Specifically, what we then test is these five things. So, of course, we test diagnostic accuracy. That's quite important. But we've also tried to move past diagnostic accuracy to understanding things about these models, like do they follow clinical guidelines? Do they follow instructions generally? Are they also understanding what they're reading? Are they able to interpret lab tests? How robust are they? These are all things that are very relevant that when we start considering how to really use these models in the clinic, and clinicians will have to work with them and they'll have to be put into systems and all of these kinds of things that we really need to understand before they can truly be useful. Okay, so let's jump into the results then. The first result is here on the mimic CDM scenario. So the simulation of a diagnostic kind of workflow in an emergency room. And here we see that, okay, autonomous clinical decision making is hard. This is a far cry from the performance that they've been able to show on the USMLE test. We see appendicitis is definitely the easiest to diagnose. The rest are harder, and the mean comes out to around 50%. If we then compare this to the second scenario where we use the full information, we see about an increase of about 15 percentage points, up to maybe even 20 percentage points if we look at the clinical camel, one of the medical models. Those are the two new red models there on the red, which indicates to us that LLMs definitely have potential as second readers. But to understand, to put this into context, right, we also need to understand how does this now compare to a doctor. So for that, we took a subset of our data set. We took 100 subjects. We took exactly 20 of each disease. So that gives us 80 in total of our diseases. And we have 20 random controls in there. So that's of different diseases, also abdominal pain diseases, just so the doctors don't get wise to the fact that there are only four pathologies that they should diagnose. And what we then see is these are four doctors from the US and from Germany. So one senior clinician from the US with 30 years of experience, three from Germany with 3 to 5 years of experience. And we see that mainly three things. The doctors are significantly better than all models. So if you look on the mean on the right, they come out to an average 89 with the best hitting around 95% accuracy. So the data set and the task is definitely doable. The data is of fairly high quality. The doctors are also much more consistent. They perform well across all tasks, while the models are very good at appendicitis, but struggle a lot more with cholecystitis diverticulitis. And there's still definitely this gap that exists between the models that we have and the performance of the doctors, even junior doctors today. So the next thing that we then tested is, okay, so why do these models sometimes struggle? Are they maybe misinterpreting something? So we decided to look at how well can they understand these lab tests. So we gave them the task, okay, here's the reference range for amylase. It's between 40 and 150 units per liter. The patient's value is 210. Is this low, normal, or high? And astoundingly, these models are really bad at this. And this is something that, any 12-year-old that understands how numbers work can do. So they really struggle with basic mathematical understanding. They typically kind of just guess normal, sometimes high or low, but I mean, these scores are very bad for something that I'm giving all of the information to the model that it needs to solve this task. There's no thinking really required here. So this was quite surprising for us. Then we decided to say, okay, if they're not looking not doing that well in diagnosis. What about treatment? Here's just, I'm always going to be showing maybe parts of our results because there's quite a lot of results and to kind of focus this. So here for diverticulitis, we see that, okay, they're quite consistent in recommending antibiotics, but in those cases that required a colectomy, these are 39 cases out of the 257 cases, they were very bad at recommending case-specific treatment. And we saw this across all of our targets. So they're not that good at following clinical guidelines. They just always recommend the most common treatment, but they don't understand the peculiarities of each case. The next thing that we then took a look at was, okay, do they even follow the clinical guidelines during the diagnostic procedure? Are they asking for the correct laboratory tests? So, for example, in pancreatitis, the clinical guidelines say you should ask for these tests for inflammation. You should test for specific pancreas enzymes and the severity of the pancreatitis in our data set, without even knowing that they're going to be tested on this, the mimic doctors, so the doctors actually, treating these patients, always requested every single laboratory test that is recommended by the guidelines. But the models very often did not, and almost half the cases did not. So they're quite poor at following clinical guidelines. Next, we also took a look at how robust are these models? Can they follow instructions well? So we asked for a final diagnosis. We also looked at what happens if we ask for the main diagnosis or the primary diagnosis. And we see large shifts in diagnostic accuracy. And the difficulty here is that this is also disease specific and it's model specific, so that for some diseases, the one wording is better, and for other diseases, a different wording is better. This makes it impossible to use in a clinic where a doctor they can't already know what the disease is going to be. If they did, they wouldn't need the model anymore. But if the model's performance changes based on the wording that the doctor uses to interact with them, that's quite worrying. So they're very sensitive to prompts too. We also examined some further things about robustness, about to see this is now in the full information category, where if we give all of the information, what happens if we just leave parts of it away? Well, we see that the models get better. So the cholecystitis performance increases by 16 points if you only give it imaging, or pancreatitis increases by 9 points if you only give it a laboratory test. And this is worrying because in a clinical state, we don't want to be trying to gather as little information as possible about the patient just because we know that our models get worse with the more that we gather, right? It's quite counterintuitive. We also checked what happens if we now change the order of the information. It's the exact same information, we've just changed its order. And now the models also are changing in diagnostic accuracy, sometimes up to 8 points. We even have models that go up to 15-point changes in diagnostic accuracy just by switching the order of information. Again, a doctor working with these models should not have to worry about what order he gives them the information that he knows. He should just talk with them freely and be confident that they will always deliver the best results. So all of these things are precisely what then gave us pause as to the current suitability of models. We understand that the field is really working very fast and advancing very fast. So a big reason why we've also created this data set and this framework is because we want it to be used to keep testing and to help develop new generations of models that hopefully will then pass all of these kind of tests that we've created here and really demonstrate both good diagnostic accuracy and robustness and through that clinical utility. So we've made the data set fully available. It's pre-processed, ready to use, easy to download. Our framework is same thing. So the testing of these models and the evaluation of them is fully available. It's so easy. You just download it, exchange the large language model, and you get to test new models. And finally, we've also have a leaderboard. Even while we were doing this project, new models came out. We tested them, and then also as soon as we published, new models keep coming out. So we also have a leaderboard where we see that the space is evolving rapidly. There are always better models, and we are monitoring them. So, for example, I showed you earlier this chart here on the US MLE, how fast progress has been. We can basically now add 2 new lines, one for mimic CDM and one for mimic CDM-FI. We've seen that there's already some progress here, but we're still far away from saturation. And we've now even included the newest models. There's even a new model that just came out 2 days ago, so I haven't included that one yet. But on the ones that have come out over the past couple of months, we've tested them, added them to the leaderboard. And while we do see progress, so CDMFI, the full information has increased by about 7 points, and CDM, the hospital simulation, has increased by about 10 points. We're still a far cry away from, I think, real clinical utility. But we're super optimistic that at the rate of improvement that we're seeing right now, that in a couple of years, I think that we're really going to have some amazing models with a lot of utility. So the takeaways are our evaluations need to match clinical reality. LLMs currently show a lot of promise as second readers, but struggle in this kind of full simulation environment. And what's really important is we need to move beyond accuracy and work closely with doctors to guarantee clinical utility. Um, so where do we go from here? What is good enough? What's going to be important is going to be randomized clinical trials, definitely, to really see what is the impact in the real world. Um, and the newest thing is vision language models. Can we replace the radiologist report with just the scan and give it direct evidence? And finally, I think what's the most promising going forward is, of course, LLMs as clinical support tools. So we need to be also testing clinicians in the loop. At the end of the day, the doctor is responsible for the health of the patient. And this is where AI should just be another tool in their repertoire that they can communicate with, that can maybe check their work. But at the end of the day, the doctor needs to be making the decision about the health of the patient. And the LLM in this case should be a support. Um, Finally, I just, of course, also like to thank all of my collaborators, especially my co-first author, Friederike Jungmann, who was a doctor who took responsibility and was a huge help on all medical aspects of this project. The four doctors that did our testing and our baseline there from the LMU, MRI, and from Christiana Care in the US, and of course our supervisors, Daniel, Bickman, and Georgios. Yeah, thanks. That's my talk, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Ja, thank you, Mr. Hager. Dankeschön für den wunderbaren Vortrag. Philipp Unberat hier. Ich darf die Abmoderation und Fragen übernehmen. Deswegen würde ich
Ja,
jetzt einmal in die Runde fragen. Gibt es Fragen aus der Zuhörerschaft? Ja, da hätten wir den Herrn Heimal.
Ja, hallo erstmal, vielen Dank für den sehr interessanten Vortrag. Ich hätte eine Frage, was die Auswertung dieser ganzen Geschichten betrifft. Sie haben ja diese
ja,
zwei verschiedenen Modelle gehabt. Einerseits jetzt mal sozusagen, wo Sie ganz vorsichtig waren, nicht zu viel Information von vornherein zu geben, und dann das
ja,
Modell eben mit der Full Information. Ähm,
ja.
Wie stark kann es sein, dass eben, wenn ich jetzt hier Full Information habe, sekundäre Hinweise sind, die eben schon darauf deuten, welche Erkrankung das ist? Das heißt, je nachdem, welche Untersuchungsergebnisse ich habe, gibt er möglicherweise einen gewissen Hinweis, welche Erkrankung hier vorliegt. Und wie kann man da am besten vorgehen, eben um diesen Effekt nicht zu haben? Gerade wenn ich solche Systeme validiere, dann habe ich, glaube ich, eine gewisse Gefahr, dass in den Daten, beziehungsweise in der Art von Daten, die eben hier vorliegt, schon Hinweise drin sind, auf welche Erkrankung zu schließen ist. Und dann kann sozusagen das Modell vielleicht am Schluss lernen, ähm, sozusagen aus der Art und Weise, wie Ergebnisse vorliegen, was dann letztendlich ist. Und wenn ich sozusagen versuche, ein Modell in die Richtung zu trainieren, kann das eben falsche Hinweise enthalten. Und wenn ich diese Information eben nicht hätte und sozusagen nicht vorliegen würde, welche Untersuchungsergebnisse ich hätte, dann könnte ich nicht so leicht auf die Ergebnisse kommen. Also beim ersten Modell haben sie es ja bewusst ausgeschlossen, und selbst da gibt es, glaube ich, noch Lücken. Und beim zweiten Modell haben sie es reingenommen. Also dieser Unterschied, der hier vorhanden ist, könnte
Ja.
genau daran liegen.
Ja, also was wir hier gemacht haben spezifisch ist, wir haben nichts trainiert. Wir haben die Modelle, wie sie sind, einfach mal ausgewertet und geprüft. Wir haben quasi ein Benchmark kreiert, wo du fertige Modelle, die nicht mehr geändert werden, einfach Fälle gibst, als ob sie, sage ich mal, jetzt schon, als ob du die heute im Krankenhaus anwenden würdest. Du deployst die im Krankenhaus und du gibst ihnen einfach den Fall und sagst, was denkst du? Und wir ändern nichts an die Information. Also hoffentlich ist da genug Information drin, um die Diagnose festzustellen. Aber ich glaube, worauf sie hinaus wollen, ist, was sich Shortcut Learning nennt, wo man halt merkt, okay, es gibt eine Abkürzung, die ich machen kann. Ich lerne nicht wirklich wieso der jetzt Appendicitis hat, sondern ich sehe immer, wenn ein Ultraschall gemacht wird, dann hat er Appendicitis. Und ich sehe hier immer in meinem Szenario 2 FI, immer wenn es Ultraschall ist, muss ich Appendicitis sagen. Aber wir haben nie trainiert hier. Wir haben ihm nie die Möglichkeit gegeben, sage ich mal, solche Sachen zu lernen, weil wir immer nur komplett wertefrei quasi die Information reingegeben haben und einfach nach einer Diagnose gefragt haben. Also die Modelle sind die Meta oder diese anderen Forschungsgruppen schon spezialisiert haben mit medizinische Text. Das ist auch der große Vorteil oder der Knackpunkt von dieses Instruction Tuning hier oder von LLMs generell, ist, dass sie ohne weiteres Trainieren sehr gut sind schon in neue oder sollen sein in neue Tests. Das ist auf jeden Fall irgendwas, was sehr wichtig sein wird, falls irgendjemand sagt, okay, ich will jetzt ein neues Modell, ich nehme mir jetzt dieses Llama 2 Chat oder heutzutage Llama 3.3 Chat und ich spezialisiere das auf genau diesen Clinical Decision Making Task. Genau dann wäre es sehr wichtig, sowas im Kopf zu halten, dass sie nicht diese Shortcuts, diese Abkürzungen nehmen. Aber in unserem Fall war das nicht relevant, weil wir sie ohne Trainieren getestet haben.
Wenn ich vielleicht ganz kurz nachfragen darf noch, ähm, verstehe ich sozusagen, wenn ich die Modelle wirklich explizit trainiere, habe ich diesen Effekt sehr viel stärker.
Ja,
Kann ich aber diesen Effekt auch haben, wenn ich eben solche bekannten Modelle schon nehme, weil die haben ja bestimmtes Anführungszeichen Wissen hier in den Modellen integriert und das kann schon solche Hinweise irgendwo in seiner impliziten Wissensbasis mit drin haben. Das heißt, bei diesem Full Information Modell kann das trotzdem noch indirekt drinstehen, selbst wenn ich das nicht explizit trainiert habe.
ja, aber dann wird es sehr schnell eine epistemologische Frage. Also ein Arzt, der, sag ich mal, du gibst in diesem Fall hier und er sieht, diese Laborwerte wurden bestellt, dann klar gibt es ihnen schon ein Indiz, welche Krankheiten es sein kann. Und ein Modell wird genau das Gleiche machen. Ich meine, du musst es ja doch irgendwas geben. Du kannst es nicht komplett nichts geben. Weißt du, du gibst ihnen halt die Laborwerte, die der Arzt für diesen Fall gesammelt hat. Du gibst ihnen die Radiologieberichte, die quasi erstellt wurden zu diesem Fall. Du gibst ihnen wertefrei alle die Infos, die die Ärzte im echten Krankenhaus gesammelt haben. Und sagst ihnen einfach, was denkst du? Was ist deine Diagnose? Es könnte sein, dass vielleicht da äh, im Pre-Training quasi von diese Modelle, dass sie sehr viel eine Krankheit mit nur einem bestimmten Keyword zusammen verbinden und dass sie deswegen diesen Sprung machen. Aber solange sie halt auch richtig diagnostizieren, ist halt auch die Frage, ist es so wichtig? Es ist halt auch immer so die Unterschied zwischen, was machen die Modelle wirklich? Ich meine, am Ende vom Tag haben sie auch kein Verständnis für, was sie machen. Das haben wir doch auch mit die Laborwerte gezeigt. Und am Ende sind es probabilistische Maschinen, die sehen halt irgendwelche Wörter und basiert auf diese Probabilities generieren neue Wörter. Dass du da irgendwelche Korrelationen hast, dass bestimmte Wörter immer bestimmte Outputs generieren, wirst du immer haben, besonders mit solche Modelle. Aber das ist tatsächlich irgendwas, was man auf jeden Fall in der nächsten Phase, je mehr man auf Verständnis untersucht, sollte man auch auf jeden Fall anschauen. Das ist ein guter Punkt.
Also ich weiß nicht, ich will jetzt nicht die ganze Diskussion dominieren. Also wenn es andere Fragen gibt, bitte melden und unterbrechen dann auch an der Stelle. Ein kurzer Hinweis noch an der Stelle. Was ich natürlich letztendlich haben will, ist, wenn ich einen neuen Patienten bekomme, kriege ich dann sozusagen die entsprechenden Ergebnisse. Also es hilft mir nichts, sozusagen einen vorliegenden Fall zu haben, sondern ich will ja gute Ergebnisse haben, wenn ein neuer Fall reinkommt. Und da habe ich
Ja,
typischerweise eben nicht dieses Full Information Setting, sondern da habe ich
genau,
eher das Setting, das Sie beim ersten Mal haben, das sozusagen
genau,
wirklich das einschränkt immer auf die Informationen, die ich zu dem Zeitpunkt vorliegen habe.
genau.
Und was ich sagen wollte, ist, dass dieser Unterschied zwischen den beiden Modellen genau den Effekt nachweisen könnte. Was habe ich an Zusatzinformationen? Das kann natürlich sein, weil wenn ich Zusatzinformationen habe, dann kann ich einfach auf mehr Informationen zugreifen und kann deswegen besser werden. Es kann aber auch sein, dass eben solche verdeckten Hinweise da drin stecken, die durch die Wissensbasis irgendwie abgedeckt werden. Ich meine, der Referenztest, den ich habe, ist eigentlich das Szenario eins, weil das ist sozusagen
Ja,
das, was ich als klinisch relevantes Szenario habe. Und ich glaube, da muss man wirklich
völlig
vorsichtig
richtig.
sein, auch bei diesen ganzen Validierungen von solchen Modellen, dass wir wirklich aufpassen, dass nicht hier in der Art und Weise, wie Untersuchungen vorliegen, Hinweise drinstecken, die eben auf die Krankheit schließen können, sondern dass wir wirklich dieses Setting, das ich in der Realität habe, sprich wirklich Stück
Ja,
für Stück solche Informationen zu akquirieren, dann als Referenz
ja,
hernehmen kann.
ja, komplett. Also man kann nicht sagen, ein Modell, was gut auf Szenario 2 ist, ist auch gut auf Szenario eins. Auf gar keinen Fall. Das ist ein komplett unterschiedliches Szenario. Das ist ein Weg, noch mehr die wissenschaftliche, quasi die medizinisches Wissen zu testen auf, sage ich, realistischere Daten. Aber das ist nicht dieser wirkliche klinische Fall von Szenario eins. Da haben Sie vollkommen recht.
Genau. Also ich glaube, wenn man es trainiert, ist es noch stärker, aber im Grunde genommen
Ja,
aus dem Ansatz, den Sie im Szenario eins haben, ist eigentlich der realistische. Oder man geht wirklich dann in ein Randomized
komplett.
Control Trial rein, wo ich sozusagen
Ja,
von vornherein weiß, dass ich diese Informationen nicht vorliegen habe.
genau. Ja.
So, nachdem wir ein bisschen später gestartet sind, haben wir vielleicht noch Zeit für eine kurze Frage, falls es eine gibt. Ist aber aktuell keine. Ja, dann danke auch noch für den sehr hilfreichen Austausch am Ende. Soweit ich weiß, gibt es aktuell noch keinen Anschlusstermin. Das wird dann Anfang 2025 verkündigt. Und dann bedanke ich mich auf jeden Fall bei Herrn Hager für diesen tollen Vortrag und bis zum nächsten Mal.
Vielen Dank für die Einladung. Mal schauen.